Ancient Egyptians wove linen so fine it could be pulled through a ring. This legendary fabric did not appear by magic. It was born from a hidden world of surprising technology and sacred skills, secrets we are only just beginning to understand. By the end of this journey, you will know exactly how a simple riverside plant was transformed into cloth worthy of pharaohs. We will uncover why the smelliest part of the process was the most crucial, and how weavers created patterns believed to hold the power of the gods. What do you believe is the most important secret a civilization can leave behind? That legendary linen began its life not in a royal workshop, but as a humble riverside plant. The true foundation of Pharaoh's cloth was flax, a crop so vital it shaped the very rhythm of Egyptian life. Its cultivation was perfectly timed with the Nile's annual miracle, the inundation. As the floodwaters receded, they left behind a thick, black, nutrient-rich silt, creating the ideal nursery for flax seeds. Farmers would sow them densely into this moist, fertile mud, a practice that forced the plants to grow tall and straight in their competition for sunlight. This was not a casual harvest. The entire process was a race against time, requiring a deep, almost sacred knowledge. The stalks had to be pulled from the earth by hand, roots and all, just as they began to turn yellow. This precise moment was critical. Harvesting too early meant weak fibers, while waiting too long made them brittle and unusable. The goal was always the longest, most supple stalks, the ones that held the potential for the finest thread. But why was this plant treated with such reverence? Flax was far more than just a raw material. It was considered a direct gift from the gods, a divine resource that provided not only clothing but also sailcloth, fishing nets, and even the bandages for mummification. Its value was so immense that bundles of flax were used as a form of currency, a tangible measure of wealth traded for other goods. This humble plant, nurtured by the sacred river, was the absolute cornerstone of a civilization, setting the stage for its astonishing transformation. But that perfect stalk was still a world away from becoming Pharaoh's cloth. The first step in its transformation was also the most brutal, a smelly, delicate operation known as retting. Workers would gather the harvested flax into tight bundles and submerge them in the slow-moving waters of the Nile, or sometimes in specially dug shallow pools. There, the stalks were left to stew, not for hours, but for days on end. This was not a passive waiting game. It was a carefully managed bacterial feast. The goal was to rot the stalks, but only in a very specific way. Microorganisms in the water would slowly consume the gummy pectin that acted like a natural glue, binding the valuable inner fibers to the useless woody core of the plant. This process demanded a watchful eye and an experienced nose. Skilled laborers, perhaps holding their breath, would constantly monitor the submerged bundles. They were waiting for a precise moment that could not be calculated by a clock. If they pulled the flax too soon, the fibers would refuse to separate, remaining stuck together and useless. If they left it for just a day too long, the bacteria would feast too long, turning the precious fibers themselves into a soft, rotten mush, destroying weeks of work in an instant. This was the secret paradox at the heart of creating the world's finest linen. To build something of legendary strength and beauty, you first had to master the art of controlled decay. The entire operation hinged on this foul-smelling, seemingly destructive act. Once the retting was judged perfect, the slimy bundles were hauled from the water, setting the stage for the next violent act in the flax's journey. The slimy, retted flax bundles emerged from the water transformed, ready for their next trial by force. Workers would first dry the stalks completely, making them brittle and easier to break. The goal was to shatter the rigid, woody core of the plant without damaging the soft, flexible fibers hidden within. This brutal process was called breaking. Using simple but effective tools, like a wooden mallet or a grooved breaking board, a worker would pound and crush the dried stalks over and over. The air would have been filled with a constant, rhythmic cracking, the sound of a plant's skeleton being systematically dismantled. Imagine the focused, repetitive motion, the swing of the arm, the sharp snap as the stalk gave way. This was not delicate work. It demanded raw strength and endurance, a relentless physical effort to liberate the valuable inner thread from its rigid prison. But the work was far from over. After breaking, the flax was left as a tangled mass of useful fibers and useless, shattered wood particles called shives. Separating the two required another violent step, known as scutching. A worker would take a handful of the broken flax and drape it over an upright wooden board. Then, with a wooden knife or scutching blade, they would scrape and beat the fibers repeatedly, knocking the last stubborn pieces of woody debris loose. Can you picture the cloud of dust and chaff that must have filled the air with every strike? This was a final, thorough cleansing by force, a necessary roughness to achieve a future of softness. The result of all this pounding and scraping was a handful of clean, pale flax fibers, now ready for their most delicate transformation. This raw, prepared material, born from water and brute force, was at last worthy of being spun into thread. Even after all that pounding and scraping, the flax fibers were far from ready. They remained a messy, tangled cloud, filled with inconsistencies invisible to the untrained eye. The final act of preparation was perhaps the most surprising, a strangely delicate and dangerous dance known as hackling. A worker would take a handful of the rough fibers and, with a confident, practiced motion, draw them forcefully through a bed of sharp, upright metal spikes. This tool was the hackle, and it looked less like a weaver's instrument and more like an instrument of torture. Each pull through those gleaming teeth performed a brutal kind of magic. The long, strong fibers, the ones with true potential, would slide straight through, emerging perfectly aligned and parallel. But the shorter, weaker fibers, called tow, would be ripped away, caught in the metal spikes like stray hairs in a comb. You can almost hear the soft tearing sound with each pass, the sound of imperfection being stripped away. This was not a single act, but a progression. The fibers would be drawn through a series of hackles, each one with finer, closer-set teeth than the last. The first hackle, with its thick, widely spaced spikes, removed the largest clumps and tangles. The final hackle, with teeth as fine and dense as a hairbrush, performed the ultimate refinement. It was this final combing that separated common linen from the cloth of legends. The fineness of those last teeth was the ultimate secret. Only the royal workshops possessed hackles with spikes so incredibly fine. Drawing the fibers through this final gauntlet removed every last microscopic imperfection, leaving behind a sliver of flax so smooth, so perfectly aligned, it felt like cool air in your hand. This was the moment the plant truly transcended its origins. The resulting sliver, a soft, continuous rope of pure fiber, possessed a sheen and a feel that was compared to silk, a material the Egyptians would not encounter for centuries. This was the priceless raw material, born from water, force, and finally, a bed of sharp metal, ready for its transformation into thread. This delicate flax sliver, now a cloud of pure potential, was useless until it gained strength and purpose. That transformation happened through the simple magic of the drop spindle, a tool whose hypnotic dance created the very thread of Egyptian civilization. At its heart, this device was astonishingly basic, just a weighted wooden disc on a straight stick, yet in the hands of a skilled spinner, it became an extension of her will. She would begin by attaching the end of the flax sliver to a hook at the top of the spindle's shaft. Then, with a deft flick of her fingers, she would set the whole assembly spinning. As it twirled, she would gently pinch the flax fibers with her other hand, walking backwards to draw them out into a long, thinning line. The weighted spindle, dangling and whirling, provided the constant tension that twisted the fibers together, locking them into a continuous, strong thread. This was not a task that required a person's full, unmoving attention. The true genius of the drop spindle was its portability. A woman could perform this work while walking to the market, watching children, or supervising other chores. Her hands were in constant, fluid motion, one feeding the fiber while the other guided the spin. A lifetime of practice making an incredibly complex task look like second nature. The rhythm was everything. The speed of the spin and the weight of the whorl, that disc at the bottom, were her precise controls. A heavier spindle, spun fast, would create a thick, sturdy thread perfect for sailcloth or heavy tunics. A lighter spindle, guided with a slower, more delicate touch, would produce the impossibly fine thread needed for the linen that felt like woven air. Every subtle adjustment of her fingers determined the final character of the cloth. a direct transfer of human skill into a material object. This was the quiet, patient alchemy that happened in every Egyptian home, the foundation upon which the weaver's grander patterns would later be built. That delicate thread, born from the patient spin of the spindle, now demanded a stage for its final transformation. Its first stage was the very earth itself. The earliest Egyptian looms were not grand wooden frames, but simple patterns hammered into the ground. This was the horizontal ground loom, a design of beautiful simplicity. Weavers would drive 2 rows of wooden pegs directly into the packed earth, creating a rectangular outline. The warp threads, the foundational lengthwise threads, were then stretched taut between these 2 rows of pegs, lying flat and parallel to the ground. The weaver's world was this rectangle. She would sit on the ground, often with her legs in a small pit dug beneath the loom, her body becoming part of the machine. To weave, she passed the weft thread, carried on a simple shuttle, over and under the warp threads, building the cloth row by painstaking row. Every pass required her to lean forward, her movements a constant, physical dance over the fabric. This was an intimate, grounded craft, but it was also limiting. The size of the cloth could never be wider than the weaver's reach, and the posture was grueling over long hours. Yet from this humble beginning, stretched across the dust, came the earliest linens that clothed a kingdom. The desire for more, for grander cloth, would soon push this technology upward, in a literal leap that changed everything. The answer was the vertical loom. Imagine the liberation of standing upright, of facing the weave directly. This new loom was a wooden frame that stood on its own, holding the warp threads vertically, like a blank canvas awaiting its artist. This single change revolutionized the craft. A weaver could now work on much longer and wider pieces of fabric, her hands free to move more quickly and with greater precision. The vertical loom did not just make weaving easier, it made the impossible possible. With the threads held taut in front of her, she could now see the entire pattern developing, allowing for the incorporation of intricate designs and colors. This was the technological leap that enabled the vast temple hangings and the elaborate, patterned garments of the nobility. The shift from pegs in the ground to a standing frame was more than an upgrade. It was a declaration of ambition, a physical reaching for the sky that mirrored the civilization's own soaring aspirations. A weaver's genius was not in the loom alone, but in the clever tools that danced in her hands. The most vital of these was the shuttle, a small, boat-shaped piece of wood that carried the weft thread back and forth. It was not merely a transport device. Its smooth, polished shape was designed to glide effortlessly through the crucial opening in the warp threads, a space known as the shed. Creating this shed was the job of another ingenious tool, the heddle rod. This was a simple stick, but its function was anything but. Selected warp threads would be looped onto this rod. By simply lifting the heddle, the weaver could instantly raise one set of warp threads, creating a clean, wide gap for the shuttle to pass through. Lowering the rod closed that gap and opened a new one with the alternate set of threads. This up and down motion, this elegant separation of threads, was the fundamental heartbeat of the weaving process. But what about the finer details, the edges, the repairs, or the intricate patterns? For those tasks, she reached for needles, often crafted from sharpened bone, or, for the wealthiest workshops, even copper. These were not for sewing garments, but for the delicate surgery of the cloth itself. A needle could tease a stray thread back into place, secure a complicated color change, or weave a tiny, symbolic figure directly into the fabric. Yet all of these tools were useless without one invisible, constant force, the secret that separated amateur cloth from legendary linen: tension. The warp threads had to be pulled with an unwavering, perfectly even tightness across the entire width of the loom. Too loose, and the fabric would bunch and pucker, creating a messy, weak cloth. Too tight, and the threads would snap under the strain, halting all progress. Maintaining this perfect tension was a weaver's eternal focus. A subtle pressure she could feel in her hands and see in the straight, flawless lines of her emerging creation. It was this unyielding, even pull that allowed each pass of the shuttle to lock into place with mathematical precision, building a fabric so strong and so uniform it could truly feel like a single, seamless piece of woven light. Yet all that perfect tension and rhythmic motion would mean nothing without a guiding pattern, the hidden language of the loom. The most fundamental of these patterns was the plain weave, also known as tabi. This was the essential, sturdy canvas of Egyptian life, created by passing the weft thread simply over one warp thread and under the next, repeating this pattern in every single row. The result was a strong, flat, and versatile fabric used for everything from the daily tunic of a farmer to the underlayers of a priest's ceremonial robes. Its simplicity was its strength, but the Egyptian weaver's ambition did not stop there. For more demanding applications, they developed the twill weave. This technique introduced a subtle but powerful shift, a staggered rhythm. Instead of a simple under one pattern, the weft thread would pass over two or more warp threads, then under one or two, with this sequence shifting slightly in each subsequent row. This created a distinct, elegant diagonal line or rib across the surface of the fabric. More than just decorative, this structure produced a thicker, heavier, and far more durable cloth. A fabric that could withstand the harsh abrasion of a desert caravan or the constant stress of a heavy sail. But the true pinnacle of their technical artistry was a rare and baffling technique known as looped pile weaving. Imagine creating a tiny noose with your thread and locking it permanently into the fabric. Egyptian weavers did this, row after row, to produce a plush, textured surface of soft loops. This is the same principle used today to make terracloth for towels. To find this in ancient linen is astonishing. It reveals a level of patience and spatial reasoning that feels almost modern. A single towel woven in this way would have taken an immense amount of time and skill. Its soft, absorbent loops a luxury reserved for the highest elites or the most sacred rituals. This progression from simple tabi to complex looping shows a culture that saw cloth not just as a utility, but as a medium for infinite invention, a textile technology that was quietly centuries ahead of its time. The patterns woven into the fabric were only half the story. Egyptian linen was far from a monochrome world of simple white. Their textiles could blaze with the deep red of a desert sunset, glow with the soft yellow of a ripening fig, or shimmer with a blue as profound as the night sky. These colors were not painted on, they were born from the very earth and sea, unlocked through a deep, chemical wisdom. To create a lasting red, dyers turned to the humble madder root. They would dig up these gnarled roots, dry them, and then crush them into a fine powder. When this powder was simmered in a vat of water, it released a rich, earthy red pigment. A yellow hue could be coaxed from the bright petals of the safflower or even from the dried rind of a pomegranate, a clever use of agricultural waste. For blue, they looked to the indigo plant or to a similar European plant called woad, fermenting the leaves in vast, smelly vats to produce that coveted, deep azure shade. But the ultimate symbol of power and divinity was a color so rare it was worth more than its weight in gold, Tyrian purple. This was not a plant dye at all. It was a secret harvested from the sea, from the mucus glands of a specific murex snail. Thousands of these tiny shellfish were needed to produce a single gram of the dye, making it an extravagant import, a color reserved for the robes of pharaohs and the borders of God's ceremonial vestments. Yet simply dipping cloth into these colorful brews was not enough. The dye would quickly wash out, fading to a dull memory. The Egyptians' true secret was a fixing process called mordanting. They used a mineral salt known as alum, dissolving it in the dye bath or treating the fabric with it first. The alum acted as a microscopic bridge, forming a chemical bond that locked the dye molecules permanently to the linen fibers. This was the final, crucial step that transformed a temporary stain into a color for the ages. It is this ancient alchemy that explains why, after thousands of years buried in tomb dust, the reds and blues on a piece of linen can still look as vibrant and bold as the day they were dyed. But the true power of Egyptian cloth was not just in its strength or its color, it was in the magic it could hold. A simple tunic could become a shield against evil, and a burial shroud a passport to the afterlife, all through the symbols woven directly into its threads. This was the spiritual dimension of the craft, where the weaver acted as a conduit for divine protection. The most important of these celestial patrons was the goddess Neith, one of the oldest and most powerful deities in the Egyptian pantheon. She was not only the goddess of weaving and wisdom, but also the primal weaver of the cosmos itself, said to have woven the world into existence on her great loom. To weave an image of Neith, perhaps shown with her iconic emblems of a bow and arrows and the red crown of Lower Egypt, into a piece of linen was to invite her direct favor and watchful power into the fabric. But her presence was only the beginning. Other potent symbols were carefully integrated into the weave. The Eye of Horus, the famous Wedged Eye, was a universal emblem of protection, healing, and wholeness. To have this symbol woven into the border of a garment or the center of a shawl was to wear a permanent, watchful guardian. The Ankh, the symbol of life itself, could be threaded into the cloth, a continuous prayer for vitality and eternal existence. The process of weaving these symbols was a sacred act. It required immense concentration and ritual purity. A weaver might have to recite prayers or maintain a state of ritual cleanliness while working, her hands not just building a pattern, but stitching a prayer into physical form. This transformed the textile entirely. A blanket for a newborn baby, woven with the protective eye, was more than just warmth, it was a spiritual armor. The linen wrappings for a mummy, inscribed with hieroglyphs and divine images, were not merely bindings. They were a coded map and a plea to the gods, ensuring the deceased's safe journey through the underworld. The fabric became a liminal space, a meeting point between the earthly and the divine, where threads did not just cross, they communed. The sacred symbols woven into linen found their ultimate expression not in a village hut, but within the vast, state-controlled factories known as the royal weaving houses. These were the industrial hearts of pharaonic power, sprawling complexes where the goal was not just to make cloth, but to manufacture perfection on an immense scale. Imagine a single hall, its air humming with the rhythm of dozens of looms, each operated by a weaver whose entire life was dedicated to this one craft. They worked alongside spinners, producing miles of flawless thread, and dyers tending vast, simmering vats of precious color. This was a synchronized ecosystem of skill, a production line designed for one purpose, to create the legendary royal linen. The secret here was not a single tool or technique, but a revolutionary concept, organized mass production. Consistency was God. Every length of fabric destined for a pharaoh's robe or a god's statue had to be identical in its sublime quality. Its weave so tight, and its thread so fine it was virtually transparent. This demanded an unprecedented level of control. Overseers with a critical eye would inspect every stage, from the hackling of the fibers to the final fold of the finished cloth. They used touch and sight to judge the thread count, searching for any deviation, any slight thickness or imperfection that would relegate the piece to a lower grade. A weaver's entire output could be measured against a single, unyielding standard held in the temple archives. This system transformed the craft from an art into a precision science, ensuring that the power and divinity of the state were literally woven into a consistent, breathtakingly beautiful material. This legendary royal linen, however, had an even more elusive cousin, a textile whispered about in ancient texts as woven air. Byssus was its name, a fabric so fine it was considered the ultimate status symbol, a visual paradox of something both there and not there. The very nature of its fiber remains one of Egypt's great material mysteries. Was it simply the absolute pinnacle of their flax craft, a thread spun from fibers selected with such obsessive care and hackled on such impossibly fine spikes that it achieved a near-mythical fineness? Or was it something else entirely, a material imported from the sea? A compelling theory suggests it might have been sea silk, a rare and precious fiber harvested from the long, sticky filaments of a Mediterranean mollusk called the pen shell. These filaments, which the clam uses to anchor itself to the seafloor, can be combed into a soft, golden fluff. Spinning this sea silk required a surreal level of patience and a touch as light as a breath. The resulting thread was not strong, but it possessed an otherworldly sheen and a weightlessness that flax could rarely match. To weave with it was to walk a razor's edge. The warp threads on the loom had to be kept under a tension so perfect, so exquisitely balanced, that the slightest variance would snap them. The weaver's shuttle had to glide through the shed with a new kind of gentleness, each pass a risk of tearing the entire delicate web. The final cloth was a triumph of human skill over impossible fragility. A gossamer web that clung to the body like a second skin of light, its transparency leaving little to the imagination and everything to power. A single tunic of true byssus would have cost a fortune, a statement so potent it communicated not just wealth, but a near divine refinement. To this day, we cannot say for certain which path the Egyptians took to create this phantom cloth, a secret they wore so close it has evaporated from history itself. Yet the final masterpiece was often defined by its edges. Once the main body of cloth was cut from the loom, the weaver's artistry was far from over. She would turn her attention to the raw ends of the fabric, where the parallel warped threads now hung loose and exposed. These were not simply trimmed away. Instead, they were meticulously transformed into elegant fringes. A weaver would gather small, even groups of these warped threads and skillfully twist or knot them together, sometimes weaving them back into the cloth's edge for a few rows to create a strong, decorative border. This careful handwork turned a potential unraveling point into a statement of finished quality, but the embellishment could become far more elaborate. Separate, colorful tassels were crafted by bundling and wrapping dyed threads, then sewing these lush, dangling ornaments onto the corners of a shawl or the hem of a ceremonial robe. They swung with every movement, a dynamic display of color and texture. The ultimate expression of luxury, however, came from the needle and the bead. Workers would painstakingly stitch tiny beads made of gleaming gold, vibrant blue faience, or smooth carnelian directly onto the linen's surface. Each bead was a small, heavy spot of light and color, a deliberate and costly addition. A simple dress could become a map of the stars with scattered faience beads, while the collar of a high priest might be entirely encrusted in gold and lapis lazuli, weighing down the fine linen with sheer opulence. These were not mere decorations. In a society where visual language was everything, the presence, complexity, and material of these fringes, tassels, and beads spoke a clear, immediate message about the wearer's place in the world. They were a walking ledger of status and wealth, proving that in ancient Egypt, true power resided in the smallest of details. This linen of such worldly luxury found its most profound purpose in the silence of the tomb. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not an end but a dangerous voyage, and cloth was the most vital supply for that final journey. The scale of this need was staggering. A single, well-prepared mummification could consume hundreds of square meters of linen, all of it meticulously woven and collected over a person's lifetime. This was not fabric for the living, it was a sacred, functional armor for the soul. The process began with the most basic form, long strips of plain, sturdy cloth used as bandages. These strips were wrapped layer upon layer around the cleansed and desiccated body, each pass a ritual act of protection, but the linen's role was far more intimate than just wrapping. Soft pads of cloth were used to pack the body's hollow cavities, restoring a lifelike shape. Smaller, finely woven pieces were placed over the eyes, tucked into the ears, and positioned between the fingers and toes, a final, gentle touch of care. The entire body was then encased in a full-body shroud, a single, vast sheet of linen often woven specifically for this purpose. This was no ordinary cloth. These shrouds were frequently inscribed with powerful incantations from the Book of the Dead, or woven with the very symbols of protection we discussed earlier, the Eye of Horus and the figure of the goddess Neith. They served as a literal text of spells, wrapping the deceased in a continuous prayer. The quality and sheer volume of linen in your tomb were a direct, unmissable advertisement of your status and your piety. A pharaoh would be entombed with linens of legendary fineness, while a commoner might make do with recycled household cloth or even painted imitations. Your eternal future was quite literally measured by the yard, a final testament written not on papyrus, but in thread. The rhythmic click of the shuttle was a sound that echoed through every level of Egyptian society, from the humblest mud brick home to the grandest royal workshop. This craft was the domain of women, a skill as fundamental to a household as baking bread or raising children. From a very young age, a girl would sit beside her mother and grandmother, her small hands learning the ancient motions of preparing flax and guiding the spindle. This knowledge was her inheritance, a practical wisdom passed down through generations, weaving the very identity of her family into the cloth they produced. In most homes, weaving was a part of the domestic economy, producing the coarse, durable linen that clothed the family, furnished their home, and could be traded in the local market for other essential goods. Yet within this widespread female domain, a stark hierarchy existed, one defined entirely by skill and patronage. The weaver in a small village produced a functional, necessary product. Her economic power was real but local, a quiet autonomy built on providing for her household's basic needs. Her life was a world apart from the artist who served the state. The weavers employed in the royal weaving houses were elite craftswomen, the equivalent of master engineers in their field. They were not anonymous laborers but known specialists, often referred to by name in administrative texts. Their work was so valued that they were paid in rations of grain, beer, oil, and even plots of land, a form of compensation that granted them significant economic independence and social standing. A woman who could consistently produce the flawless, translucent linen demanded by the temple and the court held a position of genuine respect and influence. Her craft was her key to a life of comfort and recognition. This created a fascinating social fabric within the industry itself. At one end, the majority of weavers created the sturdy, plain cloth that formed the backbone of daily life. At the other, a small, revered group of female artisans wielded their looms like artists wield brushes, creating masterpieces that clothed gods and kings. Both were essential, one weaving the cloth of survival, the other the cloth of power, their combined efforts spinning the threads that held an entire civilization together. These silent, rhythmic skills left behind more than just legends. They left physical evidence, buried for millennia in the dry, dark safety of the tombs. Some of the most telling clues are not full-size tools, but miniature worlds. Archaeologists have discovered exquisite wooden models placed in tombs, depicting complete weaving workshops in perfect, tiny detail. Here are carved figures of women, seated at their small looms, their hands forever frozen in the act of passing a shuttle. Spinners stand nearby, holding their drop spindles. These were not toys. They were magical insurance policies for the afterlife, designed to spring into eternal operation upon the deceased's arrival in the next world. They provided a perpetual supply of sacred linen, a divine wardrobe service for eternity. Alongside these models, we sometimes find the real thing, the actual tools themselves. A wooden shuttle, polished smooth by countless passes through the warp. A carved spindle whorl, its weight precisely calculated for the thread it was meant to spin. These objects feel personal, their surfaces still holding the ghost of the hands that used them, but the most direct conversation with the past comes from the cloth. In the relentless dry heat of an Upper Egyptian tomb, linen can survive for thousands of years in near-perfect condition, its fibers still strong and its colors startlingly bright. In other conditions, where fire or extreme decay intervened, the fabric did not vanish. It was transformed, carbonized into a brittle, blackened crust that retains the exact structure of the original weave. To a scientist, these fragments are a library. Placed under a microscope, a single scrap of linen tells a detailed story. They can count the number of threads per inch, a precise measure of the weaver's skill. They can map the over and under sequence of the weave, identifying a simple tabby from a complex twill, and using techniques like chromatography, they can detect the faintest chemical signature of ancient dyes, identifying the madder root for red or the elusive murex snail for purple, even when the color is invisible to the naked eye. These fragile remnants are our final, tangible link to the weaver's art, a direct analysis of the very thread that once clothed a civilization. The secrets of Egyptian linen are not just found in tombs, but in the hands of modern weavers who dare to recreate it. This is the world of experimental archaeology, a field where historians become craftspeople, using replica tools to test ancient methods firsthand. Their mission is straightforward but incredibly difficult: to grow their own flax, process it using only period-correct techniques, and weave a final cloth that could pass for an ancient original. These projects begin with a field, planting the same kind of flax the Egyptians used and harvesting it at that precise, yellowing moment. Then comes the true test of intuition, the retting process. Modern teams have discovered that judging the perfect point of decay is an art form lost to texts. There is no manual that tells you the exact smell or the specific sliminess that signals the fibers are ready. It is a knowledge that can only be earned through failure, through watching an entire batch rot into mush because the timing was off by a single day. The subsequent violence of breaking and scutching with replica wooden tools reveals the sheer physical toll of the work. Arms ache, hands blister, and the air fills with dust, a stark reminder that this craft was built on endurance. But the most humbling moment comes at the loom. Weavers who are masters of their modern craft find themselves struggling with the simple ground loom. Sitting in a pit, leaning forward for hours, they learn why certain weaving postures appear in ancient art, and they gain a profound respect for the speed and precision an Egyptian weaver could achieve in such a demanding position. These experiments have yielded a crucial, undeniable insight. The quality of the royal linen was not just about good tools or good flax. It was about a lifetime of accumulated, embodied knowledge, a feel for the fiber that was passed from one generation of hands to the next. You cannot read about this skill in a book. You can only begin to understand it by doing the work yourself, by feeling the fiber snap in your hands or slide perfectly through the hackle. This painstaking recreation proves that the true secret of the pharaoh's cloth was not a hidden ingredient, but the irreplaceable value of human mastery, a whisper of skill that has long since faded from the world. The tomb of Tutankhamun presents a silent symphony of textile mastery, a frozen moment where the full ambition of Egyptian weaving was captured for eternity. Within that sealed chamber, Howard Carter and his team uncovered not just gold, but a wardrobe for both this life and the next, a collection so vast it defied simple accounting. There were over 150 separate items of clothing, ranging from the simplest loincloths to garments of breathtaking complexity. Imagine the sheer scale of the operation required to produce this linen universe for just one young king. Entire royal workshops must have worked for years, their sole focus the perfection of every thread that would accompany him. One of the most telling examples of their skill was a simple pair of leather sandals. But these were not merely functional. Their surface was entirely covered in an intricate web of tiny beads made of gold and vibrant blue faience, each one sewn onto a fine linen backing with a precision that still stuns conservators today. Every step the king took in life, and symbolically in death, would have been a soft, shimmering display of power, the delicate cloth providing a canvas for unimaginable opulence. Then there were the gloves, crafted from the finest, most supple linen. Their fit so precise they suggest a level of tailoring we rarely associate with the ancient world. But perhaps the most technologically astounding were the pleated garments. Tunic after tunic was found with pleats so sharp, so microscopic and regular. They look as if they were pressed by a modern machine. How did they achieve this? The prevailing theory is a lost art of wet pleating. Weavers would have meticulously folded the damp, starched linen into hundreds of tiny, precise creases, then let it dry slowly in the sun, locking the shape into the fabric's very memory. This was not a haphazard process. It was a controlled, chemical manipulation of the fiber itself, a state secret held by the most elite artisans. These pleats were not just for show. They created airy, lightweight garments that moved with a fluid grace, a perfect adaptation to the relentless Egyptian heat. The artistry extended to the largest scales as well. The king was buried with full ceremonial tents and wall hangings, vast expanses of cloth that transformed his burial chamber into a portable palace. These colossal textiles were woven in sections on giant looms and then expertly sewn together. Their seams perfectly straight and strong enough to withstand the tension of being hung. Every object, from the smallest bead on a sandal to the grandest expanse of a tent, spoke the same visual language of absolute control and divine right. Tutankhamun's linen was the ultimate expression of a technology operating at its zenith, where every thread was a deliberate choice and every weave a whispered prayer for immortality. That same legendary linen was not meant to stay within Egypt's borders. It sailed across the seas, packed in the holds of trade ships as a form of international currency. The high priests of Byblos, the princes of Mycenae, and the courtiers of Babylonian kings all coveted the smooth, cool touch of authentic Egyptian cloth. In exchange for these precious textiles, Egypt received the raw materials that fueled its own grandeur. Lebanese cedarwood, tall and fragrant, arrived in the ports of the Delta, destined to become the grand beams of temples and the sacred barks of gods. This timber was paid for with linen. Elegant pottery flasks from the Aegean, filled with fine olive oil and perfumed unguents, were traded for bales of fabric. Even the Nubian gold that sheathed the tombs of pharaohs was often acquired through this same textile exchange. A single roll of fine royal linen could purchase a fortune in exotic goods, making the weavers of the Nile silent partners in every major construction project and diplomatic gift. But this trade moved more than just material wealth. It carried ideas. When a roll of Egyptian linen was unfurled in a foreign workshop, it was not just a product to be admired, it was a lesson. A master weaver in Canaan might study the tight, even weave, trying to replicate the thread count on her own loom. A dyer in Cyprus could analyze the vibrant, unfading red, realizing the Egyptians possessed a chemical secret he lacked. The very fringes and decorative techniques, the way a tassel was knotted or a border was reinforced, were all carefully observed and often imitated. The distinctive Egyptian looping technique, that plush pile used for luxury towels, began to appear in textile fragments found in Levantine palaces. This was not mere copying, it was a technological osmosis. The demand for Egyptian-style cloth created new markets and inspired local industries to innovate, elevating textile production across the entire region. The threads woven on a humble ground loom in a Nile-side village were, in fact, invisible threads of cultural influence, binding the ancient world together in a web of shared aesthetics and craftsmanship. The legacy of the weaver extended far beyond the tomb, shaping the very fabric of international trade and taste for centuries. That golden age of linen, however, could not spin its own thread forever. The intricate system that produced the pharaoh's cloth began to fray, not from a single cut, but from 1,000 small unravelings. Foreign conquests, first by the Persians and later decisively by Alexander the Great, shattered the old pharaonic economic structure. The royal patronage that had sustained the elite weaving houses slowly evaporated, replaced by new priorities and new masters. When Egypt became the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, its agricultural focus shifted massively towards grain production. Vast fields that once grew tall, whispering flax, were plowed under for wheat, a crop that fed legions but clothed no one in legendary linen. The centralized, state-controlled industry that had guaranteed quality for centuries fragmented into smaller, disconnected workshops. The deep, specialized knowledge required to produce the finest byssus or the sharpest pleats was no longer being cultivated on an institutional scale. It became the lonely secret of a few aging masters, a secret that often died with them. As the Roman and later Byzantine empires rose, new textile centers emerged in Syria, Anatolia, and Constantinople itself, developing their own famous silks and wools. Egyptian linen, once the undisputed king of cloth, became just one commodity among many in a crowded Mediterranean market. The specific alchemy of perfect retting, the feel for the final hackle, the rhythmic tension for wet pleating, these were not written down in manuals. They lived in the hands and the instincts of the weavers, and when that continuous chain of teaching was broken, the techniques simply vanished from the world. They became true secrets, not because they were hidden, but because the culture that sustained them was gone. The legacy of Egyptian weaving is therefore a paradox, a story of both magnificent achievement and profound loss. We are left with the breathtaking artifacts in museum cases, the ghostly impressions in tomb dust, and the frustrating knowledge that a skill so central to a civilization could become so utterly lost that we must now reverse engineer it, using science and stubborn experimentation to ask the silent looms of the past the simplest of questions. How did you do that? The silent secrets held within ancient linen are finally beginning to speak. 21st century science has given us tools that act as both microscope and time machine, peeling back the layers of a single thread to reveal stories no historian could ever read from papyrus. High-powered microscopes, capable of magnifying a fiber thousands of times, now examine the very surface of these ancient threads. Scientists are not just looking at the weave, they are studying the microscopic cracks and fractures along the flax fibers, patterns of degradation that tell a detailed story of the cloth's life. Was it worn frequently, creating stress points at the elbows and knees? Was it buried in a dry, sandy tomb or a damp, fluctuating environment? Each type of wear and decay leaves a unique signature, a forensic record of use and burial written in a language of tiny splits and fraying. Beyond the physical structure, genetic analysis is attempting an even more astonishing feat, extracting ancient DNA from the plant fibers themselves. While incredibly difficult, successful recovery can pinpoint the exact subspecies of flax used, revealing trade routes in seeds and identifying the specific agricultural practices of a long-lost farm. But perhaps the most ghostly revelations come from the realm of chemistry. Using a technique called mass spectrometry, researchers can vaporize a microscopic fragment of a seemingly plain, beige cloth and analyze the resulting chemical cloud. This process detects the faintest atomic shadows of elements that should not be there. It can find the unique signature of copper, a key component of the mineral alum used as a mordant, or the trace remains of bromine, an element that screams the presence of Tyrian purple, even when the human eye sees only a dull brown. These tools are turning speculation into hard data. A theory that a certain textile was dyed with madder root is no longer just a good guess based on a faded stain. It is a chemical fact confirmed by the indelible fingerprint of the madder plant's components locked within the fiber. Science is now confirming the most extravagant ancient accounts, and in some cases, challenging them, proving that our understanding of this ancient craft is being rewoven, one invisible thread of evidence at a time. The rhythmic click of the shuttle did not vanish with the last pharaoh. In a handful of workshops tucked away in Egypt's sprawling oases, the ancient craft of the loom stubbornly persists. Here, you can still find artisans, their hands moving with the same fluid motions depicted on tomb walls, weaving a tangible thread that connects today to a world 3,000 years past. These modern custodians of the craft often use the same type of horizontal ground loom their ancestors did, a simple frame of pegs and beams that sits low to the earth. The raw material, however, has changed. While the legendary flax of the pharaohs is now a rare luxury, these weavers have adapted, working primarily with sheep's wool and camel hair, fibers that are readily available and well-suited to the desert climate. The resulting textiles are thick, durable rugs and vibrant tent hangings, products born from practical necessity. Yet woven into these functional items are patterns that feel hauntingly familiar. An artisan might incorporate a simplified version of the Ankh symbol along a rug's border or echo the geometric precision of a pharaonic girdle. These are not perfect replicas, but rather a folk memory rendered in thread, a conscious nod to a grander heritage that surrounds them. For these communities, weaving is more than a trade. It is a core part of their cultural identity, a living heirloom that carries the whispers of their history in every knot. They are not trying to recreate the royal linen for a museum, but they are keeping the fundamental spirit of the craft alive, proving that the weaver's rhythm is a heartbeat that can pulse across millennia. This living tradition offers a flicker of hope, a demonstration that the knowledge, though diminished, was never completely extinguished. It survives not in vast state factories, but in the determined hands of those who understand that some threads are too important to be cut. The dazzling white linen of Hollywood epics is a beautiful fiction. In reality, the Egyptian wardrobe was a surprisingly colorful affair, a social landscape painted in thread. While crisp white linen was indeed prized for its purity and association with the priesthood, it was far from the only option. The common people did not spend their lives in immaculate white garments. Their daily wear, made from coarser, heavier linen or even wool, would have been dyed in practical, earthy tones using simple, affordable plants. Think of a farmer's tunic in a muted ochre from onion skins or a dusty red from local madder root, colors that could better hide the inevitable stains of manual labor and desert life. This reliance on color was not just about practicality, it was also about social signaling. A vibrant sash or a patterned border immediately set someone apart, marking a level of wealth and status above the laboring classes. The sheer, clinging dresses so famously depicted on screen present another historical exaggeration. Such diaphanous linen, woven from that legendary byssus thread, was astronomically expensive and reserved for the most elite ceremonies. For a noblewoman to wear a garment that, transparent in her daily life, would have been as practical and socially acceptable as a modern CEO attending a business meeting in evening gown. Her daily wardrobe, while fine, was far more modest and substantial. The real division in Egyptian clothing was not between color and no color, but between the materials accessible to different social strata. The nobility and temple elites wore the gossamer fine linen we have marveled at, a fabric that required countless hours of specialized labor. Meanwhile, the vast majority of the population, the farmers, artisans, and laborers, dressed for durability. Their clothes were woven from thick, sturdy flax or from sheep's wool, materials that could withstand the harsh demands of their work. These were the true fabrics of ancient Egypt, not the glamorous illusions of cinema, but the textured, colorful, and deeply practical garments of a living, breathing society. So from a simple riverside plant, a civilization spun its identity. The journey of Egyptian weaving was a breathtaking alchemy, transforming tough flax stalks into cloth that defined life, death, and divinity. The true secret was not one single technique, but a complete system of astonishing sophistication. It was a technology that mastered controlled decay with retting and brute force with hackling. It was a sacred art that encoded prayers into fabric, weaving the watchful eye of Horus and the power of the goddess Neith directly into the threads. And underpinning it all was a vast social and economic machine, from the village women spinning in their homes to the state-run factories producing linen as precise as a scientific instrument. This was not a minor craft, it was a pillar of the ancient world, a form of currency that bought cedar and gold, and a cultural force whose patterns rippled across the Mediterranean. The next time you see a statue of a pharaoh in a pleated kilt or a painting of a noblewoman in a flowing dress, look closer. See past the stone and the pigment to the real fabric they represent. Imagine the countless hands that grew, processed, and spun the flax. Consider the sacred knowledge in every knot and the immense value in every meter of cloth. That simple piece of linen is a hidden text, woven with the secrets of an entire civilization. What aspect of this ancient craft resonates most with you? Was it the spiritual dimension, the lost technological genius, or the quiet power of the weavers themselves? Share your thoughts and questions in the comments below, and let's keep unraveling the past, one thread at a time.